and welcome to Your Favourite Teacher. Today we're going to be looking at war photographer from the Power and Conflict cluster. In the age of selfies, Snapchat and paparazzi, we probably don't stop and think about the consequences of taking a picture as much as we should. Carol Ann Duffy's poem War Photographer addresses that question squarely, exposing not only the effects war has on individuals who cover its tragic events, but also the effects it has on us as a society who are constantly consuming images of war and disaster occurring around the world. In the poem, Duffy introduces a nameless photographer returning home to develop pictures he's recently taken in a war zone. As the photographer develops these photos, he begins to remember the events which surround them, and his own feelings of guilt and trauma become more and more clear to the readers. However, the war photographer quickly suppresses his feelings of guilt, as he's very much aware he must return to work, flying off again just as soon as the poem comes to a close. The first line of the poem immediately evokes a feeling of relief felt by the photographer as he is, in his dark room, he is finally alone. The adverb finally makes it seem as if the photographer has been waiting for this moment and suggests the relief he feels on his return, possibly because he can be away from the chaos of war. However, the reference to the dark room evokes the image of a darkened, red-lit rooms in which photographers develop their photographs. Whilst this is just part of being a photographer, Duffy uses it to remind us of an eerie, dim red light, which suggests a perverse atmosphere, especially as the colour red, in which she mentions in the third line, reminds the readers of blood. More evidence of the photographer's attempts to deal with the trauma and chaos of war are seen metaphorically as he sets out the spools of suffering in ordered rows. Firstly, this line suggests the chaos of war, with the metaphor referring to the images of spools of suffering, implying the horrors that the photographer captures. However, the fact that the photographer tries to order this chaos creates a bit of a paradox, which shows the photographer's trauma. Since they're trying to order the chaos of war, Duffy might be implying the way that this individual is trying to cope with what he has seen in a rational, similarly ordered way. The speaker's efforts to deal with the trauma of war are also seen in the simile where the speaker is compared to a priest preparing to intone a mass. As a church mass is in a place where worshippers try to find salvation and safety in religion, this could also imply the way that the speaker too is trying to save his own soul and cleanse himself of his guilt in the similar way. The photographer's attempts to cope with the guilt and the demands of his job are seen throughout the poem. The line, "he has a job to do," in the second stanza suggests to readers that the photographer is trying to convince himself to focus on the job at hand and not get distracted. Similarly, in the third stanza, where the speaker remembers the cries of a man whose picture he has taken, shows the speaker's inability to hold back the memories of the atrocities he's been witness to. The third stanza in which this memory resurfaces also contains repeated use of vague language, referring to something happening as a memory occurs and to the man only as a stranger, helps to convey the idea that he, the photographer, has tried to block out the details of these events. The fact that Duffy writes he sought approval without words to do what someone must when describing the photographer taking a picture of the man dying as he remembers it. Again, the use of the word must here, just like the line, "he has a job to do," the modal verb must sounds as if the speaker is trying to justify the photographer's job and rationalise his actions. By the end of the poem, however, Duffy moves the focus from the individual photographer to point the blame more generally at the public. First of all, the final stanza captures the photographer leaving the country again on a plane, looking down on the country in which he makes a living. Duffy writes that from the aeroplane he stares impassively at where he earns his living and they do not care. The photographer's stare being described with the words impassively implies that he is completely disconnected from his own grief and the morality he should feel for doing such a horrifying job. This unfortunately shows the worst sides of war. Though it can cause trauma and grief, it also forces us to disconnect from our own sense of morality like the war photographer has. As he's looking down from the aeroplane, he feels so far from the public and is shown to be very separate from the society in which he's living. implying that the war has changed him irredeemably. We see a sense of blame on society, as the final stanza refers to how the editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday's supplement. The fact that the photos end up in a supplement suggests that the news and therefore the people who died in the war are not even very significant to the people reading the paper. More to the point, Duffy writes, "The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and the pre-lunch beers." This sarcastic line implies the way that the news has become a very casual part of ordinary life, something which maybe affects us, but only momentarily. This sense of the war not being significant to the public and the horrors of war being dull and uninteresting is also seen in the final words, "They do not care." Interestingly though, we have seen how the photographer himself struggles to face his traumas and must overcome an attempt to justify his job. By the end of the poem, we see that he's completely ostracised and left out of society by the fact that they don't even really care for the news which he's reporting. Overall, Duffy's poem doesn't just show the effects of war on individuals morally, she also tries to show the way memory can haunt us and the way that people's role in society can sometimes mean that they are estranged and left out. This is the photographer, who in the end is separate from the rest of the public and becomes someone whose job and life they don't care about, just how they don't care about the people in the photographs. I'm Miss Meeks and we've been looking at War Photographer from the Power and Conflict cluster.